Good evening. My name is Karina Martin Hogan. I'm a member of the theology department, specializing in the Bible and ancient Judaism, and I'm affiliated with the faculty in Jewish studies and women, gender, and sexuality studies. I'm very grateful for those programs, as well as the departments of English and theology for co-sponsoring this special evening. But special thanks are due to Siobhan Berlessa, the administrator of the Center for Jewish Studies, for organizing all of the logistics of this event, and to the Center for Jewish Studies for co-sponsoring it. So welcome to all of you, both here present in the audience and those joining us on Zoom. I'm very honored to be introducing our speaker this evening, Joy Ladin, whose talk is entitled What We Make of Who We Are, Jewish, Trans, and Family Identities. She's also going to be reading selections from both of her new books, Once Out of Nature, Selected Essays on the Transformation of Gender, and Family, a new collection of poems. Joy has published 12 volumes of poetry, 2 of which have had second editions. The second edition of the Book of Anna won the 2021 Jewish Book Award in poetry. And her memoir, Through the Door of Life, A Jewish Journey Between Genders, from 2012, was also a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award. Her book of trans theology, The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective, from 2018, was a Lambda Literary and Triangle Award finalist. Joy is also a literary scholar and the former David and Ruth Gottesman Chair in English at Stern College for Women of Yeshiva University. I want to say a few more words on a more personal note about Joy as a friend of Fordham. When I was teaching the capstone class for the theology majors, Religion in New York City, in the spring of 2022, focusing on the intersection of religion with gender and sexuality, I decided to assign The Soul of the Stranger, the only full book that I required the students to read. I had read it the previous summer and decided to reach out to Joy on the off chance that she would be willing to speak to my class. To my surprise, she accepted enthusiastically. It turns out that she had already had a Fordham connection. She had been a speaker in the Modern Language Department's Diversity Initiative in 2020 as part of a roundtable on exploding the gender binary. My students loved her book and her presentation so much that the theology department invited her to be the speaker at our celebration symposium for our graduates that spring. And the following summer, Joy was also a speaker for the Ignatian Q Conference for LGBTQ students from Jesuit colleges and universities, which was held at Fordham in 2022. There are probably more examples of Joy's involvement with Fordham, but those are the ones that I was involved with. So I'm delighted and honored to be able to welcome you back to Fordham, Joy, and I'm looking forward to hearing you speak about your new books. Please join me in welcoming Joy Ladin.
Dustin Hogan, and for everybody who made this possible. I'm delighted to be here. Because of illness, I never do in-person presentations anymore. This is my second and last for this year. So I'm especially grateful for everybody who's here with me. I can't tell you how strange it is to see people who are not in boxes on a screen. It's just weird. But wonderful. So I'm going to read selections from the essays that are going to go in the reverse order of my actual journey into being a public speaker on trans identities. They started with, as so many of us have started with, telling stories about my transition. Which I always tried to cast in more general terms, but they were really very much personal stories about what I and my family were going through. And then gradually, I learned to think more generally about trans and non-binary identities and gender in general, and started looking for what I thought of hubristically as a unified theory of gender. And ultimately started thinking of trans as just a set of really interesting intellectual and spiritual opportunities, different ways to approach long-standing questions and problems of being human. So I'm going to take that in reverse order. I'm going to end with an excerpt from an essay that highlights some of the intersections between trans and Jewish identity, and start with the more general approaches. This is an excerpt from the book Once Out of Nature, which a couple of years ago, I suddenly became possessed of the idea that I had to intervene in some way in public discourse about gender issues around trans identities, because it was awful, and it's only gotten worse in the meantime. And being a recovering academic, as I am, what I thought of was, I know what will be an effective intervention, a book of essays, because that always changes everything. But it was the thing that I could think of that could come out the fastest. So this excerpt will give you an idea for the best case scenario, what I was hoping the book would do. What does it mean to live in a world in which gender is visibly, rapidly changing? How can we understand ourselves and be understood by one another when familiar terms like man and woman mean different things to different people, and when some people don't identify in familiar terms at all? How do we live, love, and work with those whose identities don't make sense to us, or who identify us in ways that contradict our sense of who we are? Even though, as an openly transgender person, I'm one of the people sparking these questions, I wrestle with them too. Since I began living as myself, living the female gender identification I hid for decades behind a male persona that fit the body I was born into, I've devoted much of my time trying to understand how trans and non-binary identities relate to more traditional ways of doing gender, and to exploring how the recognition of these identities is changing gender for everyone. Like many of us, I've been bruised by the often brutal arguments between people who do gender differently from one another. Like many of us, I long for alternatives to what those arguments pose as an either-or choice between a world that has no place for anyone who can't fit binary gender, and a world in which gender is fragmented into a world of different beliefs, terms, and ways of life. As a trans person living in an often hostile world, I understand how hard it can be to engage with those whose ideas of gender conflict with our own. It's lonely when those around me don't share my understanding of gender. It's painful to relate to people who don't accept my identity. But we often focus on how individuals identify. Even the most individualized forms of gender are inherently social, ways of identifying ourselves and others that, when gender works for us, enable us to feel seen, understood, connected. Accepting that others understand gender differently means accepting that others may not see us as we see ourselves, and that we may not see others, even close family members, as they see themselves. So it isn't surprising that no matter where we fall on the political or cultural spectrum, many of us fear that others' ways of doing gender threaten our own communities, relationships, and sense of who we are. Our shared anxieties could inspire us to think together about how to make the best of a world in which gender is no longer a set of shared assumptions and means different things to different people. But instead, our fears of losing the forms of gender that feel true to us are making it harder and harder to engage respectfully and constructively with people who understand gender in very different ways. Each of the essays in this book considers gender from a different perspective, but all aim to reduce the anxieties that drive us apart by thinking and talking about gender in ways that bring us together. And I have to say that I'm hoping my delivery also lowers anxieties. One of my students called me a human Xanax. Yeah. At a time when assaults on trans and non-binary people are multiplying, it may seem foolish to focus on fostering mutual understanding rather than fighting for civil rights and basic needs such as healthcare, employment, and housing, on which trans and non-binary lives, including mine, depend. I wouldn't have the stability and safety to do this work if innumerable trans activists and pioneers such as Victoria Cruz, Marsha P. Johnson, and Sylvia Rivera, the contemporary leaders such as Pauline Park, Yara St. James, and Laverne Cox, had not put their lives on the line for decades to make the world livable for trans and non-binary people like me. Without such efforts, my gender transition in 2007 would likely have cost me my teaching position at Orthodox Jewish Yeshiva University. Instead of writing essays and giving talks with the security of a tenured professor, I, like so many trans and non-binary people, would have had to struggle to find employment and might well not have survived at all. But even as I watched the backlash against trans rights from the relative safety of my white, educated, middle-class, blue state bubble, it seems clear to me that fostering understanding and recognition of common ground is also an essential form of activism. Trans rights and trans and non-binary lives won't be secure as long as many non-trans people fear that our identities and rights, our ability to be and live as who we are, come at the cost of theirs, and worry that by being and living as who we are, we threaten the binary forms of gender on which their families, communities, religious traditions, and ways of life depend. The more afraid we are that our ways of understanding gender, and thus our ways of life, are under attack, the harder it gets to understand others' ways of doing gender, or to see the fundamental human needs for recognition and relationship that we all look to gender to fulfill. The less we understand one another, the more likely we are to treat conflicts between different forms of gender as existential threats, a vicious circle that makes it harder and harder to recognize and address the needs and anxieties that give rise to these conflicts. It isn't easy to simultaneously live one's gender and try to understand how it seems to people who do gender in different ways. For many non-trans people, it's hard to think about their ways of doing gender at all, much less to think about them in relation to other ways. But for most trans and non-binary people, including me, this kind of thinking is a condition of existence. When we live in the closet, we have to think constantly about how our sense of who we are differs from how the binary world sees us, so we can hide aspects of ourselves that would betray who we really are. After we come out, we have to keep thinking about how our ways of living our gender seem from a binary perspective, because our jobs, housing, and safety depend on how non-trans people, family members, co-workers, neighbors, doctors, landlords, bosses, people we meet at parties, people we pass on the street, see us. For example, when I returned to teaching after my transition, I realized that my work as a teacher now required me to try to understand how my Orthodox Jewish students saw me, the first openly trans person most of them had ever encountered. Some told me they'd been warned away from me by rabbis and parents. Some found my gender so disturbing that they struggled to listen to what I said in class. Most, sooner or later, tried to ignore my gender. After all, no one takes a class so that they can think about their professor's gender, right? And just focus on their studies. To minimize the obstacles my gender might present to them, I thought about everything I said in terms of how it would sound to them, a discipline that forced me to recognize my students' own complex relations to binary gender and the conflicting forms, religious and secular, modern and pre-modern, that they had to navigate in order to live as both Orthodox Jewish true to our sense of who we and others are. I hope this book will help us do so, because all of our lives depend upon it. So, yeah, so that's the best case scenario. People read that introduction and they say, oh yeah, we don't need to. live side by side with people who practice gender in different ways, and we can still be ourselves. The practice, of course, is a little more complicated than the theory. The next excerpt I want to read you is from an essay called "We Pass for What We Are, Otherness and Humanness," which was started life as a talk to psychotherapists. Because although I've had, well, I'm not going to admit how many therapists I've had, but I've had a lot of therapists, and many of them have been extremely helpful around many of my issues, but none of them have helped me at all with the issue of being other, which has been a major aspect of my life. And I think that there are many of us, people who come out of the closet often have this kind of before being other and after being other. And then there are a lot of people who they're always seen as other because they're different in ways that are processed that way by the people around them. So this is quite a long essay, and this is a very short version. Not long after I began living as myself, I gave the first of what became scores of talks about trans identity to groups who had little familiarity with life beyond binary gender. After 4.5 decades in the closet, I was still uncomfortable talking publicly about trans identity and presenting myself not as a male persona, but as who I really was. Like many an uncomfortable speaker, I tried to put myself at ease by making a joke of my own discomfort. "Hi, I'm Joy Ladin, and I'll be your transsexual this evening," I said, playing on the introductory formula ubiquitous among waitstaff in San Francisco restaurant scene I sampled in the 1980s. I thought of this joke as an attempt to set my audience and myself at ease by naming my gender difference and defining the relationship which, for an evening, gave me, as a trans person, a place among them. But now I see it as the opposite, as a way of presenting myself that showed I knew I was being seen as other, that I was in fact offering myself to serve in that capacity, as representative of a certain form of otherness. At the time, I didn't distinguish between being trans and being other. As a result, I didn't see the difference that I called being transsexual, which is now an excruciating essay, as one of many gendered ways of being human. I saw it as a sign that I was other, inherently different in ways that made me incomprehensible, unlovable, with no place in my binary-based family or community. That terror had led me to hide my female gender identification for most of my life, which is why I reached for humor when I started speaking publicly about trans identity. If the audience would laugh with me, perhaps my difference and my otherness need not be so terrifying after all. But in a way, it's taken me years to understand. That joke was more than a fumbling attempt to diffuse my childhood fears. It was also an effort to formulate a new, less isolating way of understanding the relationship between difference and otherness, to suggest that my otherness was not essential, an unavoidable consequence of being different in the way I was different. Like being a waiter in a California cuisine restaurant, it was temporary, situational, a role I was performing for an evening for the benefit of those who wanted to serve insight into trans identity and experience. Moreover, by saying I was their transsexual, I was asserting, in a way that felt quite daring at the time, that like a waiter's difference from the diners they serve, my difference gave me a place among them. For one evening, at least, being transsexual didn't make me other. It made me theirs. I just want to point out that this also applies for Jews who are talking about being Jewish in non-Jewish contexts. I think a lot of people have found themselves going through analogous dynamics around that. In short, through this absurd equation, being trans is not at all like being a waiter. I was trying to reframe my otherness, to understand it not as an unbridgeable gulf that separated me from humanity, but as a basis for relationship. Needless to say, one throwaway line wasn't enough for anyone, including me, to transcend the complex social and psychological dynamics through which difference becomes entangled with otherness. It didn't even get a laugh. Y'all didn't laugh either, right? It's not very funny. I soon stopped repeating that joke, but I kept trying to understand and articulate the experience of being seen as and seeing myself as other. I now recognize that when I introduced myself as your transsexual this evening, I wasn't only announcing the fact of my difference. I was telling my non-trans audience that I knew that because they identified themselves and one another in terms of binary gender, they were going to see me as other, in hopes that acknowledging that would enable all of us to glimpse the common humanity behind and beyond binary gender. Of course, as a fellow poet, Chen pointed out to me some years ago, no one, including people like me who are often seen as other, is free of the assumptions and distortions built into identity-defining discourses. That's why, even as I was delivering that joke, I was still sorting the audience, as I have my whole life, into men and women, based on how they look to me. But my joke wasn't only an effort to acknowledge and find a way outside binary gender's definition of trans and non-binary people as other. It was also an expression of my own belief in my otherness, a belief I had internalized while growing up in a binary world that had no category other than other for people like me. I grew up believing both that I was really essentially female and that identifying as female made me really essentially other. It wasn't until I read W.E.B. Du Bois' pioneering work of phenomenology and sociology, The Souls of Black Folks, that I found in the concept of double consciousness that he developed, a way to understand the sense of otherness I'd internalized along with binary gender. Du Bois writes, "This American world only lets Black Americans see themselves through the revelation of the other white world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity." As Du Bois makes clear, double consciousness, always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, is a cognitive discipline he saw Black people as adopting in order to survive and navigate the white American world. He saw the discipline of constantly seeing oneself simultaneously from the inside and the outside, of always remembering how white people see Black people, as a means by which Black people navigated the institutionalized violence of white supremacy. But as Du Bois' description of the psychic split double consciousness entails suggests, double consciousness comes at a high psychological cost. It not only requires Black people to constantly remember how they're seen by white people, but to internalize and partly identify themselves in terms of this toxic racial discourse, so that racist perspectives become part of how Black people measure themselves, think of themselves, figure out who they are. I remember schooling myself in the trans equivalent of double consciousness, training myself to always look at myself through the eyes of binary gender, as early as first grade. To remain attached to family, friends, and community, I knew everyone had to see me as the boy they thought I was. To keep myself acting like that boy, I constantly measured my behavior, my gestures, every word I uttered, in terms of whether or not they fit binary ideas of maleness. A discipline I enforced by telling myself how incomprehensibly, unlovably other I would seem to the people I loved if I ever let them glimpse who I really was. When I introduced myself by saying, "I'm Joy Ladin and I'll be your transsexual this evening," I was expressing this double consciousness and inviting my audience to share it with me, to join me in simultaneously seeing me as an individual, Joy Ladin, and as a transsexual other. If they shared my double consciousness, I hoped, double consciousness would stop being something that exiled me from the binary gender world and become, perhaps, common ground from which we could all laugh at binary gender's limitations. Du Bois could have told me that wouldn't happen. But now that I've been long and seen and loved for who I am, I know that even if my joke had magically transported us beyond binary gender and the double consciousness it demands from those oppressed by it, I would still have felt other, because feeling other is built into being human. No matter how completely or happily we conform to the roles and identities we're assigned, sooner or later, most of us feel that there's something about us that doesn't fit those roles and identities. Something that makes us feel, as Ralph Waldo Emerson puts it in his essay, Self-Reliance, that we are only passing for what we are. I started to recognize this kind of otherness at the beginning of gender transition, when I began coming out to non-trans women who had befriended me as a man. I believe that these friends, unlike me, were real women, women who completely identified with the gender they were assigned at birth and never felt they were passing as the women they seemed to be. Sorry. In my dismay, each of these friends, even the most heteronormative, responded to my coming out as trans by telling me that despite being born, raised, and living their lives as female, they too had struggled to feel like the women they were supposed to be. The women who, according to binary gender definitions, they really, essentially, inarguably were. Though each told me a different story, they all described hiding or repressing aspects of themselves in order to fit with what was expected of them as women, and feeling, as a result, that they were always in some ways passing as the women they were supposed to be. I now realize I've never spoken to anyone, no matter how well they seem to fit or perform their assigned roles and identities, who has said they've never experienced the sense of sometimes, in some ways, being other than what, according to gender or other identity-defining discourses, they really, truly are. That's why I call this inherent otherness. Not just because I and those who've described it to me experience it as an inherent consequence of being who we are, but because the sense of being other than we're supposed to be is inherent in the nature of human identities. On the one hand, we develop identities, our sense of who we are, by internalizing them, by internalizing and relating to others in terms of those identity-defining discourses we share with families, communities, and cultures. But on the other hand, as self-aware individuals, we identify ourselves based on our experience of our complex, constantly changing feelings, desires, experiences, psyches that can never be fully named or fit into social roles and categories. Thanks to this combination, and that's very abstract, but a simple example is you're a mother, you really are a mother, but your colicky infant has been screaming for so long that you actually are experiencing murderous feelings, which don't really go with the role of mother, right? So that makes you feel like you're passing as a mother, and your infant's life depends on you passing successfully. So that's a good thing. But it does give you a sense that you're not fully the real deal. The real mothers, they never feel those kinds of things. Thanks to this combination of internalized identity discourses and the actual messiness of what's inside us, we always know ourselves to be at least somewhat different on the inside than we seem to those around us. And that sense of difference, the sense that we do not really fully, permanently, essentially fit the social roles and identities through which we're known by and connected to others, gives rise to the sense that we're inherently other. Inherent otherness can make us feel isolated, ashamed, and afraid. But it also offers us a standpoint from which we can resist the ways we're seen by other people or defined by social structures. Our sense of inherent otherness reminds us that no matter how we are diminished or demeaned by identity-defining discourses, no matter how brutal or seamless the systems that enforce them, or how powerful the incentives to conform, we can always be more and other than what those discourses say we are. Because whether we like it or not, we are always more and other. And whether we experience it as a strength or weakness, recognizing our inherent otherness doesn't mean that we're too different to belong. It means that we're awakening to a sense of otherness that all human beings have in common, an otherness that is the painful, glorious birthright. Emerson calls it the genius of humanity. So, in other words, even if we learn to navigate the kinds of collisions between different ways of doing gender that can make us seem unintelligible to one another, but even if we overcome those, there's still this residual inherent sense of otherness, this sense that we're all outside the discourses that we're passionately defending our identities in terms of. And to me, that is a hopeful basis, because it means that there is somewhere outside that we can recognize as common human ground, even though some of our human ground does involve conflicts that are difficult and painful and we need to deal with. But I want to turn from now the psychological messiness of gender to something that for me is much more fun. An excerpt from the last essay in the book, which is called Writing Beyond the Human, Divining the Poetics of Divinity. And one of the things that I learned is that when we can take a break from the difficulties of gender and how the difficulties of our gender and dealing with other people's gender and on and on and on, then we can enjoy the kinds of creative spaces and opportunities for new imagination and ways of thinking that recognition of trans and non-binary identities and perspectives open up for us. So I wanted to give you an example of that, poetry example, because for me, poetry is where I feel like all of me always has to come together. So my job these days is to give voice to the Shekhinah, who, in Jewish tradition, is the female, immanent aspect of God, present in human lives and sharing our sufferings. The Shekhinah isn't just divinity. The Shekhinah is divinity in the key of she, divinity conceived as female. Like most people I knew, I grew up in a world in which everyone, believers and non-believers alike, imagined God as male. In prayer books, Bibles, sermons, and conversations with Jehovah's Witnesses who occasionally rang our ethnically Jewish doorbell, God was always he. Even atheists referred to God as male. What evidence do you have that he exists, they would ask? Or, if God can do anything, can he create a way that he cannot lift? I never thought of God as gendered at all. As someone born male but who from early childhood identified as female, I knew from painful experience that gender does a terrible job of relating bodies and souls. I couldn't imagine why a divine being who had no body would bother being gendered at all. But though I didn't conceive of divinity in terms of gender, I was drawn to the idea of the Shekhinah from the moment I came across it, not as theology, but as an image of female identity independent of a female body. Everyone I knew assumed their gender identity, whether someone considers themselves male or female, was determined by physical sex, an assumption that meant it was inconceivable for someone like me to exist. But no one questions whether the Shekhinah is female. Even the most conservative religious authorities and most trans-skeptical Jewish feminists, people who would never accept my female gender identification, embrace the Shekhinah as she, though she is no more physically or socially qualified for that pronoun than I am. That was the way the Shekhinah first found her way into my poetry, not as a form of divinity, but as a closeted code for trans identity, a way to refer to my disembodied sense of femaleness without blowing my cover as a heterosexual man. For example, one of the poems in my first collection presents the eponymous Shekhinah as a silent, invisible female presence that, like my female gender identification, has little power beyond persistence. The world she perfumes has no place for her, and she can do nothing to change it. 10 years later, when I realized I couldn't live any longer as a man, but hadn't yet decided whether that meant suicide or gender transition, a much more active and disruptive version of this presence, which I refer to only as she, appeared in a poem called Following the Script. She summons, prods, and pushes the reluctant second-person subject of the poem to embark on the family-shattering process of gender transition, the you, who was definitely me, keeps trying to avoid. She was successful. When I began the poem, I was living as a man. 2 years later, I was living as myself. Even in this more potent form, my poetic Shekhinah was a secular metaphor, not a form of divinity. My late 20th century American poetic upbringing trained me to think of poems as inherently secular, and to think of writing poetry as a process that secularizes everything included in the poem, which meant that the moment the Shekhinah entered a poem, she had to represent something else: powerlessness, persistence, female gender identification, anything but divinity. Unbeknownst to me, though, some other Jewish American poets, particularly those reimagining Jewish tradition from feminist perspectives, rejected both the Shekhinah's secularization and the binary cleavage between poetry and religion. In their works, the Shekhinah isn't just poetic material. She's a vital divine female presence, as we see in Alicia Ostraker's well-known prayer to the Shekhinah, part of which says, "Come be our mother, we are your young ones. Come be our bride, we are your lover. Come be our dwelling, we are your inhabitants. Come be our victory, we are your army. Come be our laughter, we are your story. Come be our Shekhinah, come be our Shekhinah, we are your glory. We believe that you live, though you delay, we believe you will certainly come." By treating the Shekhinah and her divine femaleness as a living part of Jewish tradition, the designs of this poem go far beyond poetry. Its language is meant also as performative prayer, summoning the Shekhinah to action and summoning readers to identify themselves with the religious community in which she is recognized as divinity. The speakers of the poem evoke a future in which the Shekhinah will wield a world and history-changing power comparable to that of the biblical God. But in the here and now of the poem's invocation, as in Jewish tradition, the Shekhinah is passive, hidden, silent, spoken of to rather than speaking for herself. In other words, even explicitly feminist evocations of the Shekhinah may inadvertently perpetuate patriarchal assumptions. That is why, even as some Jewish feminists, like Ostraker, were working to give the Shekhinah a larger role in Judaism, others, like Marcia Falk, were arguing that these efforts were self-defeating, that the Shekhinah is bound to reflect the patriarchal ideas of the tradition from which she emerged. Falk writes, "Far from redeeming women, the image of the Shekhinah has, until now, only supported the male-centered vision. In Jewish tradition, the Shekhinah has never been on equal footing with the mighty Holy One, blessed be He, her creator, her master, her groom, the ultimate reality of which she was only a manifestation. And while I like the name itself, Shekhinah, from the Hebrew word meaning I dwell, I'd like to see indwelling, or immanence, portrayed in ways that are not secondary to transcendence. So too, I would like to see autonomous female images, not ones that imply the essential otherness of women. As Falk points out, tradition defines the Shekhinah's divine femaleness not only in opposition, but subordination to God's divine maleness. God sends Israel into exile. The Shekhinah goes with them. God thunders, decrees, instructs, comforts, foretells, talks and talks and talks. The Shekhinah remains silent. Shekhinah Speaks, my now completed poem collection of poems that, when I wrote this essay, was still in progress, came late to feminist arguments over the Shekhinah. So late I was free to learn from both sides without trying to resolve their contradictions. Shekhinah Speaks follows Ostraker's poem and rabbinic tradition in identifying the Shekhinah in ways that are traditionally gendered female, and also identifying the Shekhinah in non-gendered ways as well. Even the rabbis do that. At the same time, like Fall, I also worked toward a Shekhinah who is autonomously female. Female in a way that is not defined by patriarchy as the inferior complement of maleness, that encompasses whatever the Shekhinah is. One of my early breakthroughs in the writing process was, I asked myself, well, how does the Shekhinah speak? And a voice immediately said, any way she wants to. She's divinity. I have my own reasons for wanting Shekhinah to model autonomous femaleness. I grew up with the idea that gender transition meant changing myself to fit binary ideas of what it means to be a woman. When I finally embarked on that process, I thought I had to act in conventionally feminine ways to show that my female gender identification was real. But the longer I lived as a woman, the clearer it became that I would never be female in the way the gender binary defines it. I'd been born male, socialized as a male, had fathered children, published and taught as a male. The only way I can be female is in the autonomous sense, a sense that is independent of binary definitions, and so can include all of me, including aspects of my life shaped by or bound up with maleness. And so, for theological, feminist, and deeply personal reasons, Shekhinah Speaks gives voice to an autonomous female Shekhinah, a Shekhinah who, as you hear in the following poem, identifies in binary gender terms but isn't limited by them, a Shekhinah who defines herself. And this is a poem called Singing. The Shekhinah is addressing a you, but this is the first person you, and she means it to mean each one of you. So she wants to be in your face, I guess. Think, before you were a fetus, before you were an egg, you were a song I was already singing, a promise I'd already kept. I stretch out your curtains, strengthen your pegs, make room inside you for the world I created you to share. You are my embryo, and I'm your womb. You are my labor pains, and I'm the mother pushing you to cry, to talk, to stand for something, to stop being scared of the joy rising like waters in the days of Noah, flooding your foundations, crowning your head, answering every question I created you to ask. Why you feel incomplete, like a tiara without a pageant. Why you mistake affliction for love, and love, my love, for affliction. Why you just start crying when for a moment you hear me singing the secret you forget you're keeping. You are the child of a queen. Why it always feels like the first time to you, the first shaking of your mountains, the first bursting into flame, the very first season of your first reality show, on which a queen with a whirlwind where a uterus should be, whose presence fills you with fear, keeps waiting for you to say, I do, to the love, my love, that never stops singing and follows you everywhere. Though the Shekhinah here embraces roles such as mother and qualities such as unconditional love that are traditionally gendered female, nagging that are traditionally gendered female, she is not limited or lessened by identifying as female. The Shekhinah we hear in this poem has never allowed herself to be assigned to binary categories and refuses to conceal, amputate, or deny aspects of herself to fit human ideas of femaleness. Untethered to biology or binary gender categories, the Shekhinah uses female terms not to affirm what we call gender identity, but to relate to us in ways we understand, ways that demonstrate her imminent intimacy with the human you she addresses, not from above, but from within and all around us. Imminence is one of the Shekhinah's defining traits. And as Falk points out, imminence is traditionally understood as the female counterpart, complementary but also secondary to the transcendence of male-identified divinity. But the Shekhinah doesn't submit to the transcendence imminence binary any more than she does to the gender binary. As we hear in this poem, the Shekhinah is no more bound by human space and time than the male-identified God of patriarchal tradition is. Like male versions of divinity, she presents herself as active, articulate, and powerful, always, everywhere, speaking to us simultaneously from inside and far beyond us. The Shekhinah's autonomous femaleness expresses the fullness of her divinity and challenges me to express the fullness of my humanity. Thank you.